They say every choice you make, no matter how small, sets you on a path. A tiny, insignificant decision can branch your life off into a future you never could have imagined. I used to think that was just a nice, philosophical thing people said, a way to make sense of the chaos of the world. I don't think that anymore. Now I know it's true. I know because my life split in two on a sunny Tuesday in October. There's the person I was before, and the person I am now. And the dividing line, the thing that cleaved my life in half, was a cabin. A forgotten little cabin, hidden away in a part of the woods I thought I knew like the back of my hand. And inside that cabin was a book. I wish to God I had never found it. I wish I had never opened it, but I did. And now I have to tell someone. I have to get this out, because keeping it inside, I think it's finally starting to break me. My story, I guess it starts with the woods. I've always been drawn to them. Ever since I was a kid, the forest behind my house was my kingdom. While other kids were inside playing video games, I was out building forts, mapping streams, and learning the names of trees. As I got older, that love didn't fade. It just matured. I started hiking further, camping deeper. I got into photography, trying to capture that specific kind of light that only exists when it's filtered through a canopy of leaves. I even got a little into what people call urban exploration. But for me, it was always rural. Finding old, abandoned farmhouses and barns, documenting the decay. There's a strange beauty in things that have been left behind, in the way nature reclaims what we build. A sadness, too. I always felt a sort of reverence for those places. I was just a visitor, a ghost passing through the memories of other ghosts. The woods where I found the cabin, they were my favorite spot. A state forest about an hour's drive from my apartment. Big enough that you could hike all day and not see another soul. I had my regular trails, my favorite scenic overlooks, my secret spot by a waterfall where I'd eat my lunch. I thought I knew every inch of that place. I'd spent countless weekends walking its paths, studying its maps. But that's the thing about the wild, isn't it? You can never truly know it. It always has its secrets. It was a perfect autumn day. The air was crisp, and the leaves were hitting that perfect peak of color, all fiery reds and brilliant yellows. The sunlight was golden and warm. It was the kind of day that makes you feel alive, that makes all the little stresses of your life just melt away. I had my backpack with my camera, a couple of water bottles, and a sandwich. I was planning on doing my usual 8-mile loop, maybe get some good shots of the fall foliage. I started off like any other hike. The familiar crunch of leaves under my boots, the smell of damp earth and pine. I was about 2 miles in, on a stretch of trail I'd walked 100 times when I saw it. It was so subtle I almost missed it. To my left, just past a big, moss-covered boulder, was a break in the undergrowth. It wasn't a deer trail. Those are usually narrow and meandering. This was different. It was faint and almost completely swallowed by ferns and saplings. But there was a distinct, straight path leading away from the main trail and deeper into the forest. It looked intentional, old. My curiosity flared up immediately. I'd walked past this spot so many times. How had I never noticed it before? Maybe it was the way the light was hitting it. Maybe a branch that had been obscuring it had finally fallen. I don't know. But in that moment, seeing that ghost of a trail, I felt a pull. It was the same feeling I got when I found an interesting old barn, that thrill of discovery. My planned hike was forgotten. I had to know where this path went. I checked my phone. I still had a signal, and the GPS showed my location on the main trail. The area where the new path led was just blank green space on the map. Nothing. No old roads, no landmarks, nothing. That only made it more enticing. A trail to nowhere. A true mystery. I sent a quick text to my friend, just a casual, "Hey, going off trail for a bit to explore. I'll check in a couple hours." A little bit of a safety habit I'd gotten into. Then I pushed aside a low-hanging branch and stepped onto the path. The difference was immediate. The air changed. On the main trail, it had been bright and open. Here, the tree canopy was thicker, older. The sunlight struggled to get through, and the forest floor was cast in a permanent-looking twilight. And it was quiet, eerily quiet. The sounds of birdsong and chattering squirrels that had been my soundtrack just moments before faded away. All I could hear was the soft thud of my own footsteps on the packed earth and the sound of my own breathing. It wasn't a threatening silence. It was a heavy, ancient silence. The kind of quiet that feels like it's been waiting for you. I walked for what felt like a long time. The path was surprisingly easy to follow once I was on it. It twisted and turned through thick stands of old-growth trees I didn't even know existed in this part of the forest. I kept checking my phone, but the little blue dot of my location was just moving deeper and deeper into the blank green. I should have been nervous. A part of my brain, the logical part, was telling me this was a bad idea. I was alone, on an unmarked trail, with no idea where I was going. But another, stronger part of me couldn't turn back. It felt like I was being led, like the path itself was pulling me forward. Every now and then, I'd stop and just listen. Nothing. Not a breeze, not a rustle of leaves, just that deep, profound silence. I remember thinking it was like walking through a photograph, a beautiful but unnervingly still world. The feeling of being watched started to creep in. It wasn't a scary feeling, not yet. It was more like I had stepped into a place that was sacred or private, and its unseen owner was simply observing me, curious about my intrusion. After maybe an hour of walking, I started to feel like I was getting somewhere. The trees began to thin out just a little, and I could see more light ahead. And then I walked out of the trees and into a small, circular clearing, and my breath just caught in my throat. There it was, a cabin. It wasn't a tumble-down wreck. It was standing. It was whole. It was made of thick, dark logs, chinked with some kind of pale, hardened mud. The roof was wood shingles, green with moss. A thin, crooked chimney made of river stones stood against one side. It had a single door in the front and two small windows, their glass so clouded with age and dirt they were almost opaque. It looked like it had grown out of the ground along with the trees, ancient, forgotten, and utterly, completely isolated. I just stood there at the edge of the clearing for a few minutes, trying to process it. My heart was thumping. This was the kind of thing you read about, the kind of discovery every explorer dreams of. An untouched piece of history, hidden away from the world. Who built it? A trapper, a hermit, someone trying to escape the world a century ago. There were no signs of anyone, no path leading out of the clearing other than the one I had just taken. No stacked firewood, no tools leaning against the wall. It looked like it had been sealed off by the forest for decades. Slowly, carefully, I started walking towards it. My boots made no sound on the soft, mossy ground of the clearing. It felt like a sacred space. I did a slow circle around the cabin first. The back was the same as the front, just solid log walls and the stone chimney. I tried to peer into the windows, but it was useless. The grime was too thick. I could only make out vague, dark shapes inside. I ended up back at the front door. It was made of thick planks of wood, held together with black, wrought iron straps. The handle was a simple iron ring. I stood there for a long time, just looking at it. The logical part of my brain was back, and it was screaming at me now. This is private property. You can't just go in. This is how horror movies start. But the curiosity, it was a physical ache. I had come all this way. I had been led here by this impossible trail. I couldn't just turn around and leave without knowing what was inside. It felt like giving up on the last page of a book. I told myself I would just peek, just open the door a crack, take a quick look, and then leave. I wouldn't touch anything. I wouldn't disturb anything. Just a quick peek for my own curiosity. I reached out, my fingers hesitating for a second before they closed around the cold iron ring. I expected it to be rusted shut. I expected to have to pull with all my weight. But when I turned it, there was a loud, grating click of an old latch disengaging from inside. I pulled. The door moved. It opened with a low, deep groan that seemed to go on forever, echoing out into the silent clearing. The air that washed over me from inside, it wasn't what I expected. I expected the musty, damp smell of rot and mildew. But it wasn't that. It was dry. It smelled of ancient, brittle paper, of dust so old it had lost its smell, of dried herbs like sage and lavender, but faint like a memory. And underneath it all, there was another scent, something metallic and faintly sweet, a coppery tang that I couldn't quite place. The smell wasn't bad. It was just strange. It was the smell of time itself. I took a deep breath, my hand still on the door, and I peered into the darkness. It took a few moments for my eyes to adjust from the daylight. Slowly, shapes began to resolve themselves. What I saw wasn't chaos. It wasn't a ruin. It was a room, a perfectly preserved single room. It was like I had opened a door into the past. I stepped inside, pulling the door open just wide enough to slip through. It was dark, with only a few dusty beams of light cutting through the grime on the windows, illuminating floating dust motes like tiny stars. The air was thick and still. Everything, and I mean everything, was covered in a blanket of gray dust that looked as soft as velvet. To my left was a simple bed built into the wall. On it was a mattress of what looked like burlap stuffed with straw, and on top of that, a quilt. The quilt was faded, its patterns barely visible, but it was neatly, perfectly folded. Against the far wall was the stone fireplace, the hearth clean except for a pile of soft, white ash. It looked like it hadn't been used in 100 years. Next to the fireplace were a few crude shelves, and on them were tins and glass jars. I could see the faint outlines of preserved vegetables and fruits inside. The labels on the tins long since faded to illegible gray smudges. In the center of the room was a small, square table and a single, straight-backed wooden chair tucked in perfectly. It was all so neat, so orderly. It wasn't abandoned. It was just stopped. It looked like someone had tidied up, planning to come back tomorrow, and tomorrow just never came. The feeling of loneliness in that room was immense, a profound and patient stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of a hurried departure, just a life paused mid-frame. My eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The neatness of it all was what was so unsettling. It didn't feel like a place where someone had died. It felt like a place someone had simply vanished from. My gaze eventually landed back on the table in the center of the room. There was a candlestick with a nub of a burnt-down candle in it. And next to it was the only thing in the entire cabin that didn't seem to be swallowed by that thick, uniform layer of dust. It was a book. It wasn't a large book, maybe 9 inches tall, 6 inches wide, but it was thick, very thick. It sat there in the middle of the table, and while there was a light film of dust on it, it was nothing like the heavy blanket that coated everything else. It was as if it had been placed there much more recently, or as if the dust itself was afraid to settle on it. It drew my eye like a magnet. In that room of gray and brown, it was a focal point of dark, deep color. The cover wasn't leather, not exactly. It was some kind of hide, maybe deer or something tougher, dyed a dark, almost black color. The texture was strange, uneven, and slightly rough under the dust. There was no title on the cover or the spine, no markings of any kind. It was completely anonymous. I felt that pull again, that same inexorable curiosity that had led me down the path. I walked towards the table, my footsteps silent on the dusty floorboards. I was holding my breath, I realized. The air in the cabin was so still, it felt like a sacrilege to disturb it. I stopped beside the table, looking down at the book. It seemed to exude a strange presence. It sounds crazy, I know. It was just an object, an old book on an old table. But it didn't feel like that. It felt important. It felt awake. I could feel a faint warmth coming from it, a subtle heat that I could feel on the back of my hand, even from a few inches away. It was bizarre. There was no source of heat in the cabin. The sunbeams were weak and cool, but this book was undeniably warm to the touch. My mind was racing. What was this book? A journal, a Bible? Why was it the only thing that seemed cared for, or at least less forgotten than everything else in this place? Owner of this cabin may have vanished, but it seemed like this book was what mattered most to them. It was the centerpiece of this lonely, silent room. I knew I shouldn't touch it. I knew it. Every instinct for self-preservation, every rational thought was telling me to back away slowly, walk out of the cabin, close the door, and run. Run back down that path and never look back. Forget I ever saw any of this. Some things are better left alone. Some secrets are not meant to be found, but I couldn't. The urge to know was too powerful. It was more than curiosity now. It felt like a need, a hunger. I had to know what was inside. Who would leave a book like this in a place like this? What secrets did it hold? My heart was pounding in my chest, a weird drumbeat in the silent cabin. The sound was so loud in my ears, I thought it might shake the dust from the shelves. Everything told me to leave, to shut the door, and forget I ever saw this place. But my hand had other ideas. It felt like it was moving on its own, disconnected from my panicked thoughts. I watched, as if in a dream, as my fingers trembled as I reached out over the table. I told myself again, just one look. Then I'll put it back. I'll leave it where it belongs. I reached out and I touched the cover. The moment my fingertips brushed against the cover, I felt it. The warmth. It wasn't just a physical heat anymore, it bloomed. A strange, deep warmth that sank into my skin, through my fingers, and raced up my arm like a fever. It was a shocking, intimate sensation, and I snatched my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at my hand, half expecting to see it burned, but it looked perfectly normal. Yet, I could still feel the phantom heat, a tingling echo of the contact. The silence in the cabin seemed to deepen, to become heavier. The feeling of being watched intensified, shifting from passive observation to something active and expectant. It felt like the entire room, the dust, the still air, the shadows in the corners, was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. The rational part of my brain was a tiny, screaming voice in the back of my head, telling me to get out. Now, don't look back. But it was drowned out by a deafening wave of something else. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a profound, almost painful pull, an intellectual gravity I couldn't escape. The book sat on the table, and it felt less like an object and more like the center of the universe. What secrets did a thing like this hold? What knowledge could make it feel so alive? My hand moved again, slower this time, deliberately. I was no longer a hapless visitor. I was a participant. I placed my palm flat against the strange, hide-like cover. The heat was there, a steady, pulsing warmth, like laying a hand on the chest of a sleeping animal. It felt ancient, powerful. I let my fingers trace the surface. It wasn't smooth. It was a landscape of subtle ridges and valleys, a texture that was both rough and soft at the same time. I felt a faint vibration under my palm, or maybe I imagined it. A low, subaudible hum that seemed to resonate directly with my bones. I slid my fingers to the edge of the cover. It was heavy, much heavier than a book its size should be. With a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of my heart, I lifted it. The front cover opened with a stiffness that spoke of immense age, but there was no sound, no creak of a spine. It opened in utter silence, and I looked down at the first page. The paper wasn't paper, not like anything I knew. It was thin, almost translucent, the color of old ivory. It felt impossibly delicate, yet strong. And upon it was writing. It was done by hand, in a black ink that seemed to drink the weak light from the windows, making the script stand out with an impossible clarity. The handwriting was meticulous, a series of elegant, razor-sharp lines and cruel, curving hooks. It was a language I had never seen before. It didn't look like anything from this world. Some symbols were vaguely geometric, while others were disturbingly organic, looking like twisted-up insects or diagrams of bones. I felt a pang of disappointment, quickly followed by a fresh wave of intrigue. Of course, I couldn't read it. It was a fool's hope. But as I stared at the page, a strange thing began to happen. The symbols, they weren't just sitting there. My eyes unfocused slightly, and it was like they began to move. Not literally shifting on the page, but my perception of them did. They squirmed at the edge of my vision, the sharp angles seeming to soften, the curves seeming to tighten. A headache began to build behind my eyes, a dull, throbbing pressure. I fought the urge to close the book, to rub my temples. I forced myself to focus on a single block of text. I stared at it, trying to decipher it, trying to find some sort of pattern, a familiar root word, anything. It was gibberish, elegant, terrifying gibberish. But then it happened. I wasn't reading the words. I wasn't translating. The meaning just arrived. It seeped into my mind, fully formed, bypassing my eyes and my conscious brain entirely. It was a thought, an idea, placed directly into my head, and the idea was horrifying. The first passage I understood wasn't a story or a spell. It was a philosophical argument. It described the physical body not as a vessel for a soul, but as a cage made of pain. It argued that bone, flesh, and blood were a prison designed to limit perception. It spoke of sensation not as a way to experience the world, but as a constant, low-level scream that deafens us to true reality. It described ligaments as chains and skin as a suffocating blanket. The language was cold, academic, but the concepts were so viscerally repulsive that I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. It wasn't just nihilistic, it was celebratory. It praised the idea of dismantling this cage. It spoke of true sight being available only to those willing to peel back the layers of the self, literally. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I must be imagining it. The strange atmosphere, the isolation my mind was playing tricks on me. I blinked and looked at a different part of the page. Another cluster of symbols. I focused. The headache intensified. And another thought bloomed in my mind, unwelcome and invasive. This one was about doors, but not doors and walls. It spoke of the spaces between things, the space between seconds, the space between thoughts, the microscopic gaps between atoms. It described these empty spaces not as voids, but as surfaces, as membranes that could be punctured. It suggested that what we perceive as reality is only one thin layer, and that with the right knowledge, the right pressure, one could push through the emptiness and find what lies on the other side. It didn't say what was on the other side. It just called it the truer place. My breath was coming in ragged gasps now. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating. I felt a slick sheen of cold sweat on my forehead. This book, this wasn't a journal. This wasn't a Bible. This was a textbook of madness, a grimoire of cosmic horror written by something that despised existence itself. I needed to close it. I needed to put it down and walk away. but I couldn't. I was mesmerized. The revulsion was mixed with a sick, thrilling fascination. This was knowledge nobody was supposed to have. These were ideas that could shatter a mind, and they were right here in my hands. I turned the page. The page turned with a soft, whispery rustle that was impossibly loud in the silent room. The next page wasn't text. It was a diagram. My stomach clenched so hard I thought I was going to be sick. It was a drawing of a human hand, but it wasn't right. It was anatomically perfect in its detail. The bones, the muscles, the tendons, all rendered with surgical precision. But the artist had added bones. There were too many joints in the fingers, allowing them to bend in ways that were fundamentally wrong. The thumb was split into two, like a claw, and growing from the wrist, like a sixth finger made of knotted bone, was a long, serrated spur. Below the drawing were notes, those same cruel symbols. I didn't even have to focus on them. The knowledge flooded in. It wasn't a depiction of a mutation. It was an instruction manual. It was a guide on how to achieve this. It spoke of pressure points, of specific angles for breaking and resetting bone, of herbs to chew that would deaden the nerves just enough. It was a recipe for self-mutilation, presented as a path to evolution, a way to make the hand a better tool. For what? It didn't say. I slammed the book shut. The sound of the heavy cover hitting the pages was a dull, final thud. It broke the spell. The headache receded slightly. Nausea subsided to a queasy knot in my stomach. I was panting, my knuckles white where I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. The cabin was just a cabin again, a dusty, forgotten room. But something had changed. The silence was no longer expectant. It was disappointed. It was angry. I looked around the room, my eyes wide with terror. The weak beams of sunlight from the windows seemed dimmer now. The shadows in the corners looked deeper, darker. Was that a flicker of movement by the fireplace? I stared, my heart ramming against my sternum, but there was nothing. Just motionless, ancient dust. I was losing my mind. This place was making me lose my mind. I had to get out. I pushed myself away from the table, my chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. The noise was a violation. I backed away towards the door, my eyes locked on the book. It just sat there, innocuous, a dark rectangle on a dusty table. But I knew what was inside. I knew the poison it held. It felt like it was watching me, daring me to leave it, daring me to try and forget what I had seen. My hand was on the iron ring of the door. My escape was right there. A few steps, and I would be back in the clearing, back in the sunlight. I could run down that path and pretend this never happened. Just leave it. Leave it for the quiet and the dust. Let it sleep for another 100 years. It was the sane thing to do, the right thing to do. But a thought surfaced in my mind, slick and persuasive. What if someone else finds it? Some other hiker, stumbling off the path just like I did. What if it's a kid? Someone who wouldn't understand the danger. Someone who wouldn't be strong enough to close it. The thought of that book falling into other hands made me feel physically ill. I had a responsibility now. I was the one who woke it up. I had to protect others from it. That was the reason. It was a good, noble reason. Then another thought, darker and more honest, pushed its way through the first. What if I leave it here and I need it? What if those ideas, the ones about the nature of reality, what if they're true? It was terrifying knowledge, yes, but it was asterisk knowledge asterisk. The book offered answers to questions I never even knew existed. To leave that behind, it felt like walking away from the discovery of a lifetime. It felt like an act of cowardice. I stood there, torn, my hand on the cold iron of the door. One part of me screamed to run, to save myself. The other, a newly born part of me that I didn't recognize. A part that tasted of cold fascination and intellectual hunger, whispered to stay, to take it, to own it. The final thought that decided it was the most chilling of all. I couldn't leave it here because I was afraid it wouldn't stay. The idea was insane, illogical, but I couldn't shake it. The feeling that if I left it, it would find its way to me anyway, that the connection had already been made when I touched it, when I opened it, when I let its thoughts into my head. Leaving it behind felt like leaving a predator alive after it had already caught your scent. I let go of the door. My fate was sealed in that moment. I walked back to the table, my movements stiff, robotic. My hands were shaking again, but I forced them to be steady. I looked down at the book one last time. It was just a book. That's what I told myself. Just a bound collection of pages. I was in control. I reached for my backpack, which I dropped by the door when I came in. My hands fumbled with the clasps. I opened the main compartment and then walked back to the table. I didn't want to touch it again with my bare skin. I used the edge of my jacket to slide it off the table and into the open maw of my backpack. It landed with a solid, heavy thud against my water bottle and sandwich. I quickly zipped the bag shut, as if sealing a monster in a cage. The moment the book was hidden from sight, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted again. A palpable wave of cold, malevolent pressure filled the room. It felt like I had committed a terrible theft, and the owner of the house had just woken up. A low groan echoed through the cabin, the sound of old wood settling, but it sounded like a growl. I flinched, spinning around, but there was nothing. That was it. I was done. Slung the backpack over my shoulders. The weight of it was immediate and unsettling. It felt like I was carrying a block of lead. I turned and practically lunged for the door, not looking back. I yanked it open and stumbled out into the clearing, into the daylight, blinking against the sudden brightness. I didn't pause. I ran. I didn't bother finding the faint path I came in on. I just crashed through the undergrowth in the general direction I knew the main trail was, branches whipping at my face and arms. The forest no longer felt silent and ancient. It felt alive and hostile. Every rustle of leaves was something following me. Every shadow thrown by a tree was a lurking figure. The air, once crisp and clean, now felt heavy and filled with whispers I couldn't quite make out. The pull I had felt leading me to the cabin was gone, replaced by a feeling of being pushed, of being chased out by an unseen force. The woods wanted me gone. I ran harder than I think I've ever run in my life, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. I could feel the hard, rectangular shape of the book bouncing against my back with every stride, a constant, physical reminder of what I had done. It felt like it was trying to burrow into me. Finally, After what felt like an eternity of panicked scrambling through the woods, I burst through a thicket of ferns, and my feet landed on the familiar, well-trod dirt of the main trail. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for air, my lungs burning. I leaned against a tree, my head spinning, and the world was normal again. The sun was warm. A light breeze rustled the colorful autumn leaves. I could hear birdsong again, a cheerful chirping that had been absent in the cabin's woods. A couple of hikers, a man and a woman in bright jackets, walked past me further down the trail, laughing about something. They glanced at me, gave me a friendly nod, and continued on their way. Normality was so jarring it made me dizzy. I looked back at the wall of trees I had just emerged from. There was no path, no break in the undergrowth, nothing to suggest there was anything back there, but miles of dense forest. It looked impenetrable. For a terrifying second, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. The path, the clearing, the cabin. Was it all a hallucination, a waking dream? But then I shifted my shoulders, and I felt it. The dense, obscene weight in my backpack. It was real. I had it with me. I didn't linger. I turned and walked as fast as I could without breaking into a run and drawing attention to myself, back towards the parking lot. Every step felt heavy. The 2-mile hike back felt like 20. The ordinary beauty of the forest was lost on me now. Every crooked branch, every dark hollow in a tree trunk seemed sinister. I was carrying a contamination, a piece of the darkness, back into the light with me, and I felt like the world itself could sense it. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember much of it. I just know I kept the radio off, unable to stand the thought of any noise. I kept glancing at my backpack, sitting on the passenger seat like a malevolent passenger. Did I imagine it, or was the fabric around where the book sat seem darker? Was it just a trick of the light? I got back to my apartment. The familiar sight of my own street, my own building, offered no comfort. It all felt fragile, like a stage set that could be torn down at any moment. I fumbled with my keys, my hands still shaking, and practically fell inside, locking and deadbolting the door behind me. I leaned against it, my eyes squeezed shut, my heart still racing. I was home. I was safe. But I didn't feel safe. The silence of my apartment wasn't the comforting silence I was used to. It was the other silence, the heavy, listening silence from the cabin. I had brought it home with me. I shrugged the backpack off my shoulders and let it fall to the floor. It landed with a heavy, sickening thud. I stared at it. I knew I had to hide it. I couldn't just leave it there. I couldn't throw it away. My God, the thought of putting it in the trash, of some sanitation worker finding it, it was unthinkable. What would it do to them? I dragged the backpack into my bedroom and opened my closet. I pushed aside old shoes and boxes until I found a space in the very back, behind a dusty suitcase I hadn't used in years. I shoved the backpack in there, the book still inside it, and piled clothes and other junk on top of it, burying it, out of sight. I closed the closet door and stood in the middle of my bedroom, in the quiet of my apartment. But it wasn't quiet. My ears were ringing, and I could feel it, even through the backpack, through the clothes, through the closet door. I could feel the presence of that book, a cold spot in my own home, A little piece of that silent, waiting darkness from the cabin, now nested in the heart of my life. I walked over to my window and looked out at the city lights coming on as dusk began to fall. The world looked exactly the same as it did this morning. People were heading home from work. Lights were turning on in other apartment windows. A whole world completely oblivious. But I knew that something fundamental had changed. My life had a before and an after, and after began today. I was no longer just an explorer of forgotten places. I was the keeper of a forgotten thing, a thing that should have stayed lost. And as I stood there, a terrifying realization settled over me like a shroud. I hadn't just found a book, I had been found by it. And this was only the beginning. The first few days were a study in denial. I tried to live my life as if nothing had happened. I went to work. I answered emails. I made small talk with my coworkers by the coffee machine. I smiled, I nodded. I pretended to be the same person I was before that Tuesday. But it was all a performance, a flimsy, transparent act. Underneath the surface, I was a wreck. My mind was a constant, looping replay of the cabin. The heavy silence, the smell of ancient dust, the unnatural neatness of it all. And the book, always the book. Every mundane task was haunted. I'd be washing dishes, and my mind would flash to the diagram of that hand, those extra joints, that bone spur. I would be walking down the street and suddenly feel the phantom weight of the book on my back, a ghost of that panicked run through the woods. The world, which had always felt so solid and real, now seemed thin, brittle. I'd catch myself staring at the space between objects, thinking about what the book had said. Gaps that could be punctured, membranes that could be pushed through. The thought made my skin crawl. Sleep offered no escape. In fact, it was worse. The first night, I dreamt I was back in the cabin, but it wasn't empty anymore. There was a figure sitting in the chair at the table, its back to me. It was tall and unnaturally thin, wrapped in dark, ragged cloth. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me, waiting for me. The entire dream was just me standing by the door, paralyzed with fear, while this thing just sat there, its presence filling the room with a cold, malevolent pressure. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought my chest would break. The next night, I dreamt of the forest. I was running, just like I had been after I took the book. But the path never ended. The trees were twisted and wrong, their branches like grasping claws. And there was a sound behind me, not footsteps. It was a wet, tearing sound, like fabric being ripped, over and over again. I knew with a certainty that only exists in dreams, that if I looked back, I would see something that would completely unmake me. I just kept running until I woke up, gasping for air in the darkness of my bedroom. After that, I started to dread going to sleep. I would stay up as late as I could, watching mindless TV, trying to exhaust myself. But even when I was awake, the paranoia was setting in. My apartment, my sanctuary, no longer felt safe. I'd be reading on the couch and be seized by the unshakable conviction that someone was watching me from the hallway. I would whip my head around, and there would be nothing there. Just an empty, silent corridor. I started hearing things. A soft, scratching sound from inside the walls. a faint, whispery sigh that seemed to come from right behind my ear. I told myself it was just the building settling, my mind playing tricks on me because I was sleep deprived. But I didn't believe it. The source of it all, I knew, was in my closet. That damned book. Its presence was a cancer in my home. I could feel it. Sometimes it was a literal cold spot. I'd walk past the closet door, and the air would be degrees colder, a pocket of winter in my warm apartment. Other times it was just a feeling, a weight, a dark, silent pressure emanating from behind that door, pushing on the edges of my reality. I started avoiding my own bedroom as much as possible, sleeping on the couch. I'd close the bedroom door at night, as if that would be enough to contain it. It was. I thought about getting rid of it. The thought obsessed me for days. I could burn it. That seemed like the most logical thing to do. Take it out somewhere, douse it in gasoline, and light a match. Watch the cursed pages turn to ash. But then I'd remember the strange warmth it gave off. What if it didn't burn? The image of that book sitting unscathed in a roaring bonfire, its black cover seeming to mock me, sent a shiver down my spine. I could bury it, drive out somewhere remote, dig a deep hole, and leave it to the earth. But what if someone found it? Some kid with a metal detector 100 years from now. I couldn't bear that responsibility. I couldn't pass this curse on to someone else. I even had the wild thought of encasing it in concrete and dropping it into the ocean. But the book's own philosophy came back to haunt me. The spaces between things. What if burying it or sinking it wasn't an end? What if it was just putting it somewhere closer to whatever it was connected to, so it stayed, a silent, brooding guest in my closet, and my life continued its slow-motion collapse. I called in sick to work twice in the first week. My friends would call, and I'd let it go to voicemail. I Arabic lamb, Arabic meme answer their texts. How could I explain? How could I tell someone that I was being haunted by a book? They'd think I was crazy. To be honest, I was starting to think I was crazy too. The terror and the paranoia held me in their grip for almost a week. But then, something else started to creep in. The same thing I felt in the cabin. The curiosity, the intellectual hunger. My mind kept returning to the things I had understood. The horrible, fascinating ideas. The body as a cage of pain. Reality as a thin membrane. It was repulsive, yes, but it was also profound. The book offered a perspective on existence that was so alien, so complete. It made all of human philosophy seem like children's stories. The thought began to grow in the back of my mind, a little weed of an idea. What else was in there? What other secrets did it hold? I survived the first reading. I wasn't insane, not yet anyway. Maybe I was strong enough to handle it. Maybe if I just understood it better, I could figure out how to control it, how to fight it. You have to know your enemy, right? The justifications started to pile up, one after another, building a rickety ladder of rationalizations right up to the closet door. It was a Saturday night, almost 2 weeks after I found the cabin. I hadn't slept for more than an hour or two at a time for days. I was a ghost in my own apartment, thin and pale, with dark circles under my eyes. The silence in the apartment was deafening. I couldn't take it anymore. The waiting, the not knowing, the feeling of being stalked by something I couldn't see. I made my decision. My heart started to pound, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was anticipation, a dark, exhilarating thrill. I walked into my bedroom and stood before the closet. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I opened it. The air inside was freezing cold. It smelled of dust and that faint, coppery tang I remembered from the cabin. I knelt down and started pushing aside the junk I had piled on top of my backpack. Shoes, old clothes, a box of papers. Finally, I saw it. The dark green fabric of the bag. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the zipper. I pulled it open, and there it was, lying in the bottom of the bag, nestled against my now forgotten camera. The book. It looked darker. The hide of the cover seemed richer, the blackness deeper than I remembered. It was just sitting there, patient, as if it knew I would be back. I didn't use my jacket this time. I reached in with my bare hands and lifted it out. The warmth was immediate and intense. It pulsed against my palms, a slow, steady living beat. It felt like coming home. The thought terrified me, but I pushed it away. I was in control. I was just going to look. I was just going to understand. I took it out to the living room and placed it on my coffee table. I turned on a single lamp, casting a small pool of yellow light in the otherwise dark room. My entire world shrank to that table, to that book. I sat on the floor, cross-legged, and just looked at it for a long time. It didn't feel like I was looking at an inanimate object. It felt like a confrontation, a negotiation. Finally, I reached out and opened it. The cover fell open in that same eerie silence. I didn't turn to the pages I'd seen before. I let it fall open to a new spot, somewhere in the middle. More of that sharp, cruel script. I braced myself, took a deep breath, and let my eyes fall on the words. I waited for the headache, for the nausea. It came, but it was different this time, milder, as if the book was welcoming me, making it easier. And the knowledge began to seep in. This section wasn't about body horror or theoretical physics. It was about sound. It described the human ear as a crude instrument, capable of perceiving only a laughably narrow band of frequencies. It claimed that the air around us is not silent, but screaming with information. It spoke of voices in the static between radio stations, of messages encoded in the groaning of a house settling, of entire languages spoken in the patterns of wind whistling through a crack in a window. It called these things echo constructs, the residue of things that had happened, and the faint whispers of things that were yet to come. Then it offered a way to hear them. It was a kind of meditation, an exercise in unlistening. It instructed the reader to sit in a quiet room and focus not on the sounds, but on the silence between them, to find the shape of that silence, to follow its contours. It said that if you could listen to the silence deeply enough, for long enough, you would begin to hear what it was trying to hide. I tore my eyes from the page, my mind reeling. This was different from the first things I'd read. The diagrams of mangled hands were pure revulsion. This was seductive. The idea of hearing the secret sounds of the world, of perceiving a hidden layer of reality. That was a siren's song to the explorer in me. It was the ultimate discovery. It was knowledge, power. I turned another page. This section was about memory. It argued that memory is not a recording of the past, but a flaw, a scar, a glitch in perception that chains a being to a linear experience of time. It said that true consciousness does not remember because it exists in all moments at once. It then described a technique for breaking memory, for deliberately introducing contradictions and falsehoods into one's own past. It claimed that if you could damage your own memories enough, you could weaken their hold on you. You could untether yourself from the timeline. It didn't say what would happen then. It just implied a kind of freedom, a terrible, absolute freedom from cause and effect. I read for what must have been hours, page after page of these poison philosophies, each one more terrifying and more alluring than the last. I learned of things I can barely bring myself to think about even now. There were descriptions of sympathetic geometries, shapes, and angles that could be drawn that would supposedly warp the physical space around them. There was a chapter on dreams, describing them not as products of the subconscious, but as glimpses into other, real places, and it offered methods to gain conscious control, to use your sleeping mind to travel. The book wasn't just a manual for self-destruction. It was a blueprint for tearing down reality itself. And the most horrible part was, it was starting to make a sick kind of sense. The world began to feel like a flimsy illusion, and this book, this horrible, wonderful book, was the only thing telling the truth. I don't know when I stopped reading. I think the sun was starting to come up. The feeble gray light of dawn was filtering through my blinds. I closed the book, and the silence of my apartment rushed back in. But it was a different silence now. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was the silence the book had described. A silence full of potential. A silence that was listening. The next few days were a blur. I didn't go to work. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't eat. My entire existence was the apartment and the book. I didn't even open it again. I didn't need to. The things I had read were branded onto my mind. They were working on me, changing the way I perceived everything. I started seeing things, little flickers at the edge of my vision, a shadow in the corner of the room that would dart away when I looked directly at it. I'd be staring at the wood grain on my floor, and for a split second, the patterns would seem to shift and flow like water. The world was becoming unstable. The whispers I had been hearing before were louder now. They were no longer just indistinct sighs. They were taking on the shape of words in a language I couldn't understand. But the tone was coaxing, persuasive. It was telling me to just try one of the exercises, to see for myself that the book was telling the truth. And God help me, I wanted to. The rational part of my mind, what was left of it, was screaming that I was having a psychotic break, that I was sleep deprived and starving myself into hallucinations. But the other part of me, the part that had been nourished by the book, whispered that this was it. This was enlightenment. This was the peeling back of the veil. I fought it for as long as I could. 2 days. 2 full days of sitting in my silent, haunted apartment, slowly going out of my mind. The line between what was real and what was in my head was completely gone. I was living in a nightmare, and I I couldn't wake up. On the third night, I broke. I was sitting on the floor of my living room, staring at the wall. The whispers were incessant now, a constant chorus at the edge of my hearing. Try it. Just listen. See what's really there. Fine, I thought. Fine. I'll do it. I'll prove that it's all in my head. I'll do the stupid exercise, hear nothing, and then I can finally admit I'm crazy and get help. It seemed, at that moment, like the most logical thing in the world. So I did it. I did what the book said. I got into a comfortable position, closed my eyes, and focused on the silence. It was hard at first. My mind was racing. The whispers were there. The phantom scratching sounds were there. My own heartbeat was a drum in my ears, but I followed the instructions. I didn't try to block out the sounds. I just let them be. And I focused on the space around them, the negative image of the soundscape. I focused on the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and then on the shape of the silence that it was carving out of the room. I focused on the distant traffic outside, and then on the deep, dark ocean of quiet that it was floating in. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I lost all track of time. My body became still. My breathing became slow and deep. I sank into the silence, and that's when it happened. The whispers stopped. The faint scratching stopped. The hum of the fridge, the traffic outside, my own heartbeat, it all faded away. There was a moment of absolute, perfect, impossible silence. A total void of sound. It was the most profound quiet I have ever experienced, and it lasted for maybe 3 seconds. Then a new sound began. It wasn't from the room. It wasn't from outside. It was from everywhere and nowhere. It started as a low hum, a single, pure tone that vibrated in my chest, in my bones. And then, riding on top of that hum, I heard it, a voice. It wasn't a human voice. It was dry, like rustling paper or the skittering of insects in a dry wall. It spoke in a slow, measured cadence. It wasn't speaking the language from the book. It was speaking perfect English. But the sound of it, the texture of it, was utterly alien. It was a voice that had never been shaped by a tongue or lungs. And it said one thing, just one sentence. It said, "We see you listening." My eyes snapped open. I was on my feet, stumbling backwards, my hands flying up to cover my ears, even though the voice hadn't been in my ears. It had been in my head. I crashed into my bookshelf, sending books tumbling to the floor. I scrambled away, crab-walking backwards until my back hit the far wall of the room. I slid down to the floor, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. The room was the same. The lamp was on. The book was closed on the coffee table. But everything was different. The compact had been broken. I had listened, and something had listened back. The whispers I had been hearing weren't my imagination. They were an invitation I had just accepted. I sat there, huddled against the wall, for the rest of the night, too terrified to move. The silence of my apartment was gone for good. It had been filled. I could still feel the echo of that voice in my mind. Dry, ancient, and patient. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was pleased. I had come looking for secrets. I had thought I could dip my toe into this ocean of forbidden knowledge, just to see what it was like. But I understood now. There is no dipping your toe. There is only the plunge book wasn't a window to look through. It was a door, and I had just opened it, put a foot through, and announced my presence to whatever was waiting on the other side. And the worst part, the part that chilled me to the very marrow of my bones, was a single, undeniable feeling that rose above even the terror. I couldn't wait to hear what it would say next.